So then next, let's give some thought to this category of optimism. And one of the things I appreciate about the resilience work that we looked at is, remember, the authors talk about this optimism being realistic, that it's based in reality. It's not just putting on my rose-colored glasses and saying, oh, everything will be fine. Nothing wrong here. I appreciate that because sometimes optimism can feel a little naive. But even so, I want to suggest that when we think about this in light of faith, I want to suggest that we talk about Christian hope instead of simply optimism. Because optimism is really a psychological term. It's thought of as a personality construct often. And hope is more than that, as we know. Hope is my orientation to my whole life. It's not just how I go into a difficult work meeting. It's what gets me out of bed in the morning. It's how I see it all cohering. It's my worldview that grounds everything. It's what I return to again and again. And without hope, it's hard for me to imagine being resilient. Clearly, optimism is very, very helpful. But from a faith perspective, it's hard for me to imagine really being resilient through life without Christian hope. So, this interesting challenge from 1 Peter, always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Why do I hope? And in whom and in what do I hope? Can I make an accounting of that? So let's think about that. And so I want to connect this thinking about hope to another area that's very significant in grief studies nowadays, which is the idea of story. And this idea that all of us are living a story. And I may not think about it consciously every day, but it's kind of there in the background. And sometimes it rushes to the foreground. For instance, why am I up here this morning? Why am I teaching at the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College? Well, it's connected to my life story. It's part of the plot of my life. There are a series of events that have brought me to this point. It's true for all of us. How did any of us get where we are? Our life story has unfolded in a particular way. So we're all living a story, in a sense, and it seems that thinking about our life in that way is something people do cross-culturally. Kids learn to do it very young. When we ask kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? We're asking them to imagine the future story. We could also say, well, we're just asking for information. No, well, yes, but we're also inviting them to be writing a future script, a future plot line. Okay? So what can happen when the worst occurs, when a tragedy strikes, when I'm under awful stress, when there's a terrible loss, it can feel like my life story has been disrupted. A researcher and a psychologist who I draw on a lot by the name of Robert Niemeyer, he uses the term narrative disruption. Narrative meaning story. I'm living my story, everything's fine, and then something can happen and it can feel like my story comes to a screeching halt. Those of you who do a lot of work in healthcare settings, you probably see this constantly. Everything was fine, and then boom, this occurred. And now, it may be my life story makes no sense. It can feel almost like pages have been ripped out of the story of my life. And now I don't know what the next chapter is going to be. And not only can that be terribly, terribly painful and disorienting and stressful and frightening, but it can also mean that at least for a time, I may not have any hope. If my hope was linked to the way I thought my story was going to unfold, and now that story cannot unfold that way, or at least not fully, it may be that my very sense of hope is shaken. So in the grief world, this is what we are thinking more and more about. The journey of grief for many people is not about stages of grief. It's not about completing certain tasks, although some people find that to be an accurate description of what they experience. But more and more we think about what is happening to the person's sense of story, and do they have hope? Do they have hopeful meaning for the future? So this is where I think the Christian faith story is just so vital, that when I can continue to place my story within the Christian story, I know my story is not over. My particular story may feel deeply affected. My particular life story may feel like, a story with no future. But from a faith perspective, my story is not over, because I'm always part of that larger story. My story is embedded in God's story. And that's a hopeful story. That because God is constantly active in our world, there will be another page to my story. There will be another chapter. There will be a future story. One of the things we can struggle with when the worst has happened, and it may not be the worst, but when something difficult has happened, I can feel like everything is at an end. And so the idea that, well, I'll start a new chapter, or I'll start a new page, that can feel just impossible. But I find these words by Jürgen Moltmann helpful. From a faith perspective, in every end, a new beginning lies hidden. In every end, there's a new beginning, because God is constantly at work in all our lives. It may be a great challenge to see that new beginning, and we may not see it for quite some time, but it is there. And then I was recently speaking with someone about some of these categories of faith and resilience, and he said, you know what I find really helpful? Just the phrase, on the third day. Just that phrase. And he said for him, that language, that phrase alone is a metaphor, is a reminder that the story continues. That the story of Christ did not end on the cross. That there was a third day. There was new life in which we all are invited to participate. So we have meaning so far, and I'm suggesting that we think about God's love, God's merciful, compassionate love, as just a bedrock faith meaning for us, which therefore gives us hope. Because in God's love, God is constantly active in our lives, creating the new thing. And so there is always hope. And our story is always part of God's story of love.